anonymously really into the attendees. Without further ado, I welcome you all to Art Historical Reclamations, which is a panel that came together as CACE was going online. I was reaching out to art history colleagues in the region, and we found 3 very strong papers we're excited about hearing today. And I think we're going to go with a hold the questions till the end, just in case we have longer kind of periods. So if you have a question, sort of write it down or write it in the Q&A, and it will stay there so that we can then take hopefully at least one question for each panelist and maybe have a discussion between papers at the end. So we are going to go in order of the conference presentation order. And so first we have up Michelle Fikrig from UNC Chapel Hill with her discussion of It's My Inheritance, Nostalgic Potential in South African Family Photographs.
Thank you so much. Let me just get my slides up. Start out. Okay. So in her series, Kele Falaka, Her Story, by South African artist Lebogang Kganye, new ethereal family photographs are created by overlaying self-portraits onto old snapshots of the artist's late mother, Dimakatso. When Lebogang returned to her family home after her mother's death in 2010, she flipped through her mother's old albums and was suddenly struck by the photographs she had seen a dozen times before. She also found her mother's clothes still hanging in the wardrobe as tangible artifacts that had outlived her. And these heirlooms became deeply involved in the making of the series Kele Falaka, Her Story in 2013. Through the 2-part process of restaging her mother's photos as self-portraits, just in the same clothing, and on the left here we see one of the self-portraits, and it's crucially the exact same dress. And then overlaying these self-portraits onto the source snapshot at varying levels of transparency using Photoshop, Lebogang expands her family album to include these composite scenes that are based on memory and longing. For the project, it is not enough for Lebogang to simply leaf through her mother's albums and imagine the two of them together, or to hear her relatives recounting the events of the photograph. She must instead create new relics of the past that suggest a physical connection between the women through the insertion of her own body. So typically, looking through family photos is understood as a nostalgic activity. Many discussions of family photos therefore center the object's role as a mnemonic aid of the past. And this focus, which is supported by traditional understandings of nostalgia, roots the genre in the visualization or even negotiation of the past, rather than seeing the photos as constructing new possibilities for the future. In her seminal book on the topic, The Future of Nostalgia, Svetlana Boym outlined 2 tendencies of nostalgic impulses: restorative nostalgia, which emphasizes nostos and attempts to rebuild home through a shared teleological view of the past, and reflective nostalgia, which dwells in the algia and the fragmented and imperfect process of remembrance. The process of remembrance strives to narrate the relationship between what has been and what will be, taking into account that the past represents and opens, quote, a multitude of potentialities, non-teleological possibilities of historic development, end quote. While restorative nostalgia may adhere more closely to traditional understandings of the past as an isolated entity, reflective nostalgia breaks down this teleological approach and projects the past forward into the future. And so using montage, Lebogang disrupts the standard nostalgic then versus now paradigm, conflating past and present into one image in this vein of reflective nostalgia. Initially, the artist had thought to display the original snapshot pulled from her mother's albums and her restaged self-portrait side by side as a diptych, but her mentor encouraged her to layer the images. Lebogang acknowledges that this modification, quote, spoke truer to this journey of me wanting to create a space or a time where we could still be together, end quote. And the resulting works splice together different geographic and temporal layers to create an alternative space and time in which to be reunited with her deceased mother. I believe that this alternative space and time is central to the series' nostalgic potential, as it disrupts the indexical nature of photography and its ability to conjure up or replace a specific moment. Each image alone may index a specific event, but together the clarity of space and time is disrupted by the overlapping elements, begging the question, which moment does the montage on the right refer to, past or present? Given this disruption, I argue that the images in Kele Falaka, her story, index an alternative third time, a mythic space of potential in which the women can be reunited and in which substitute histories can be played out in order to process the fragmentation of personal narratives. So I'll turn here to the main image I'll discuss, Sechwanso Le Nwaka 2. In this photograph, Lebochan's mother, Dimakatso, is on the right here, and she smiles broadly, crouching down in the grass in a vivid fuchsia outfit as she reaches out towards a toddler teetering nearby. Just behind Dimakatso, a semi-transparent adult Lebochan crouches as well. You can see her in the center, dressed in the same bright fuchsia outfit, again, the same exact piece of clothing. Dimakatso's left arm remains clearly visible while Lebochan's right arm cuts through the overlapping forms so that together the two women reach out toward the toddler on the left. A reading of the image using Boehm's concept of reflective nostalgia, which again takes into account non-teleological narrative possibilities, opens up a multitude of meanings of this type of performative association between daughter and mother. Writing on reflective nostalgia in a South African context, psychologist Jill Bradbury suggests that, quote, the object of nostalgia and hope is neither place nor time, but the subject, the self that was and is yet to be. These earlier potential selves cannot, of course, be recovered directly and can only be known from our current positioning in the present. Seen through this lens of reflective nostalgia, by embodying her mother in the photograph, both by wearing her clothes and literally overlapping the forms of their body, Lebochan is able to process a self that is yet to be, namely a maternal one. Following the death of her mother in 2010, Lebochan, who was then only 20 years old, assumed the maternal role of primary caretaker to her 12-year-old sister, Chupiso. This image can thus be read as, on the one hand, a nostalgic image of Dimakatso's love for her daughter Lebochan, or it can be read as a way of Lebo processing the familiar role that she would come to fill. The pose and motion of Lebo's right arm reaching out toward the toddler in tandem with Dimakatso's left one literally situates Lebochan within the maternal role. The title, which is translated from the original Sutu as "A Picture with My Child," remains sufficiently vague, so the toddler can either be Lebochan or her sister Chupiso. In this alternative reading, in which the toddler is Chupiso, Lebochan is then reaching out toward the child as if she herself was the mother, prefiguring the relationship that would grow between the two women. By appearing twice in the photo, once as her toddler self and once in the guise of her mother, Lebochan is able to reflect on her multifaceted role as daughter, sister, mother from her current positioning in the present, conflating her past self and her future into one image. Scholar Annette Kuhn's conception of memory work is useful here to expand on the reflective nostalgic potential. As conceived of by Kuhn, memory work is an active process of mining and investigating materials for possibilities. This may sound familiar because the active practice of remembering that Kuhn describes as memory work can be understood as steps towards Boehm's reflective nostalgia and its process of remembrance. Both are fragmented, non-teleological approaches to the past, in which individual moments can be mined in multiple ways to produce meaning both in the present or the future. In Kuhn's book, Family Secrets, she outlines the steps in which one can perform memory work. And the first asks the practitioner to, quote, consider the human subjects of the photograph by taking up their position, even visualizing yourself as the subject as she was at that moment in the picture, end quote. While Kuhn argues that this visualization is purely a metaphorical exercise, and that memory work would take place with, as opposed to in, the photographs and albums, Lebochan goes farther and inserts herself into the image as a semi-transparent figure in her version of memory work, literally positioning her body as her mother's. And I see this discrepancy of prepositions, although minor, as really important in terms of temporal implications. For Kuhn, performing memory work on a photographic image is akin to the contemplation of a frozen past moment, with this frozen moment being at the core of indexical understandings of photographs as images that point to a discrete entity, which can function here as the other object connected to the viewer by the preposition with. In contrast, performing memory work from in a photo, as Lebochan does using montage, allows for a temporal and spatial ambiguity as the time and space between the original moment and the restaged moment is condensed and conflated. Lebochan's use of Photoshop to layer the two images allows for a seamless merging between images and the moments that they index, so that no lines disrupt the illusion of uniform space and time, however fictive it may be. The newly created temporality of the montaged image defies the indexical and positivist nature of the component photographs as pointing to any singular moment. And so by inserting her body into the scenes, Lebochan fully embodies her contemplation of the past, blurring the temporal lines between original snapshot and recreation. It's important to note, however, that Lebo is not only manipulating the time of the image by inserting her adult body. Images from the series are produced less through insertions of her body into an image of a younger self than through the overlaying of complete images. So while some parts of the photo remain fully saturated and appear untouched, like the toddler's jeans or Dimikatsu's left shoulder, which look really solid and saturated, other parts of the image bleed into one another. Over the white of the toddler's sweater and in the background above the women's heads, particularly over Dimikatsu's head, the pattern of bricks, the rectangular pattern of bricks is visible. And the pattern spotlights the toddler's almost translucent nature. Not only is adult Lebochan a ghostly figure in the scene, but her presence changes the status of the other figures. The three bodies are joined together. Lebochan and Dimikatsu seem to share each other's arms, and the toddler's transparent body appears to be at once in front of and behind the woman's arms, so that the three are flattened into the same artificial plane. Beyond Lebochan's symbolically occupying the same role as her mother throughout her outreached arms, the three bodies appear to merge into one another, becoming a hybrid corporeal space that can function as the conceptual site upon which trauma and its discourses are negotiated. Grouped together in this way, the embodied histories of her mother, Chanye's younger self, and her own stories become wrapped up together in collective memory. The image becomes not only about a moment of happiness in the yard, but about the entire scope of the mother-daughter relationship. And the use of family photos for this temporal merging is really important because of the theoretical understandings that the genre is to be shared and collected as a medium to relay memories to future generations. However, some would argue that memory is individual and that it ultimately cannot be transferred to another without losing its essential quality. So in this vein, Susan Sontag claims that, quote, what is called collective memory is not remembering, but a stipulating. That this is important, that this is a story about how it happened, with the pictures that lock the story in our mind. Ideologies create substantiating archives of images, representative images, which encapsulate common ideas of significance and trigger predictable thoughts and feelings, end quote. According to Sontag, the communal remembrance that occurs when viewing a photo album is not true memory, however elusive the concept of truthful memory can be. This is because a memory of an event photographed can only be experienced anew as a memory by the subject of the image. In other words, memories rely on direct experience. Instead, the archives of images about which Sontag speaks encapsulate neatly the bounds of history, producing a shared version of the past that, like Boehm's restorative nostalgia, manifests itself in total reconstructions of monuments of the past. To the restorative nostalgic, the past is not a duration, but a perfect snapshot, one which we may objectively take in or even perform memory work with, but not subjectively experience. So turning back to this image, by inserting herself into scenes of her mother, Label Khan seems to argue that collective embodied experience or memory is possible. As she and her mother reach out toward the toddler together, the event is experienced by both women. So that if a memory is tied to an individual's neurological networks, as some would claim, by inserting her body into the scene, Label Khan attempts to unstick the memory from Dima Katsu's experience. Instead, the two women appear to share the same corporeal space in which to experience the event collectively. In this fictive time and space, which exists outside of the nostalgic then versus now paradigm, Label Khan is able to create a shared corporeal space in which both her memories and those of her mother can be invoked and negotiated together. Thank you.
Excellent. Yay! We can all do virtual waves. And definitely place any questions you have for either any of the speakers into the Q&A. I'm writing questions down, of course, it's my role. But we'll move through each of the talks and then we will move on to Q&A after. I'm trying to get to my CACE program. There's too many windows open. Darn it. Here we go. So next we have up Sidney Pettice, who is going to present her paper, Iconoclasm in Ancient Egyptian Art History, and she's here with us at UNCCH.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, my PowerPoint. All right, can everyone see?
Perfect.
All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be talking about iconoclasm in ancient Egyptian art history. And the first thing I like to do is define iconoclasm. So it can be defined as intentional damage or destruction of objects and images that hold cultural significance. So, when we think about objects and images that hold cultural significance today, we might think of public monuments. So, just to jump over to my image here, this is an image of one of Hatshepsut's sphinxes that would have been found outside of her tomb. And we can think of this structure as a public monument of the ancient Egyptian time period. So, the ancient Egyptians were very connected to their art, and it had a very big relationship with leadership, and it held a lot of importance within their culture and lifestyle. So there was an uplifting of representation of important cultural and religious figures. And they also believe that within these sculptures, like the one here, the spirit or the ka of the person being depicted was within these figures. This ancient Egyptian belief resulted in the target of intentional destruction or disabling of these artifacts by many generations, and it plays a big role in the way iconoclasm happens, which is the next point I would like to discuss. So, with the disabling of figures when intentionally damaging or destroying an object, the ancient Egyptian iconoclasts would choose to target specific areas. So, they would specifically target the nose, left and right arms and legs, the headdresses of royalty, and the names of royalty as well. And the nose was targeted when intentionally damaging a structure because if the structure or the statue or figure did not have a nose, the ancient Egyptians believed that the spirit or ka within the figure would be unable to breathe, which would, ultimately kill them. And then the left and right arms and legs face intentional damage in figures made for offerings. So, figures made for offerings would usually be found in tombs of royalty, and they usually have the left arm offering and the left foot forward, and in some cases, right arm and foot. And when intentionally damaging these objects and figures, iconoclasts look to harm these royal figures in their afterlife, as well as erase these kings and queens from the ancient Egyptian history. So here on these two images, in the first image above, I have a head of another Sphinx of Hatshepsut, very similar to my last image here, but this one has significant damage to the nose and to the headdress. And then the bottom image is a figure made for offerings, which has damage to the hand, disabling it from giving its offerings in the afterlife. So next, I would like to talk about intention, why iconoclasm happened, and some of the driving factors that led to this damage by discussing three historical figures I based my research around. So first, I like to talk about Hatshepsut. She was the focus of my research around her life beginning at Queen Regency. So we can think about Queen Regency as being a co-ruler or advisor alongside a young king. So Hatshepsut's husband was the pharaoh Thutmose II, and he faced an early death, and his son was of a young age, and this was Hatshepsut's stepson. So he was too young to rule, so she was appointed queen regent alongside him. While she was the queen regent, images featuring Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, her stepson, often look like the image on top. So they're seen on the right side and they're seen exactly identical, putting emphasis on their power as two equal beings. But for some unknown circumstances, during her queen regency, she appointed herself as pharaoh or king. Many researchers debate on what drove her to this decision and if there is a theory, but there is no distinct theory currently. Researchers are just able to highlight a kind of drastic change in depiction of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. So images start to look like the bottom image here, where Hatshepsut is seen by herself before the sun and air god Amun. She is a very well-known historical figure of ancient Egypt because in many images depicting her in the traditional pharaonic dress. So here she's depicted in the same way, in the same dress as Thutmose III in the image above. So she kept the title of pharaoh, but still embraced her femininity in many of images, figures in her likeness. Her relationship with her stepson played a big role in figures and objects displaying her likeness facing iconoclasm. After her death, when Thutmose III became pharaoh, he ordered for images and figures and her name presented as pharaoh to face intentional destruction. And he did this with the intention of erasure, to take her away from their history. He did this because he feared the ancient Egyptian citizens would point out that Hatshepsut is not his blood mother, but only his stepmother, and he did this out of fear of being an illegitimate pharaoh. Bloodline and lineage held great significance within the ancient Egyptian culture. So to bring everything together about Hatshepsut, Hatshepsut's images and figures faced iconoclasm for a highly politically driven reason. With political position and bloodline playing such an important role in ancient Egyptian society, Thutmose III looked to erase her of their history. I think a great fact to conclude about Hatshepsut and Thutmose III is that he only sought to erase her memory as pharaoh. So images like the one on top featuring the two together, they exist and they exist with minimal damage, but ones on the bottom or ones featuring Hatshepsut as pharaoh face a lot of damage and are very hard to find. So next, I'd like to discuss Akhenaten and how he was a catalyst in social and ethical change of ancient Egypt. So Akhenaten became pharaoh around 1358 BCE, and he's best known as the pharaoh of the Amarna period, where stylistic and religious reform began. He ordered for all ancient Egyptian citizens to worship and acknowledge Aten as the sole god and creator of the universe, which kind of mirrors polytheism or polytheism, excuse me, or monotheism. And oftentimes figures will be seen with a similar body type. So here in both you see a very similar style. So usually in ancient Egyptian art, they are muscularly fit, very symmetrical with flat stomachs, as well as arms and legs showing little to no curve to their skeletal structure. And then figures from the Amarna period, on the other hand, represent people in a very organic or natural body shape and type, and they're popularly known for their over-exaggerated facial features. And a minor period artwork often shows both women and men with very almond-shaped eyes. So I think a very great example is in Akhenaten's face here, and in both Akhenaten and Nefertiti's faces here. So Akhenaten's stylistic and theological change is the primary reason for the intentional destruction of images in his specific style and likeness after his death. After his death, his son, Tutankhamun, re-established the traditional polytheistic beliefs of ancient Egypt and brought back the traditional Egyptian artistic style. In order to bring back these traditional customs and artistic norms, Tutankhamun ordered for works to be made in the Amarna period, featuring Aten as the sole god and Akhenaten as pharaoh, to be destroyed. And Tutankhamun's orders are a great example of iconoclasm being used as a form of erasure due to a social and ethical change. He wanted the Egyptian population to forget these drastic changes in religious practice and artistic style that his father brought about while he was pharaoh. So next, I will be discussing Nefertiti and her role in ancient Egypt. So she was the wife of Akhenaten and the stepmother of Tutankhamun, and she was likely Akhenaten's primary wife. Though a lot of information about her is uncertain or unknown, a major reason why her history is unknown is because of her relationship with Akhenaten and the iconoclasm that the Amarna period and Akhenaten as pharaoh faced. She was so closely related to him and his legacy as his wife that images in her likeness faced intentional destruction and damage as well. Similar to Hatshepsut, she was a queen regent alongside Tutankhamun, and she likely had sole leadership over ancient Egypt for a period of time. Evidence shows that there was a significant relationship between Nefertiti and Tutankhamun, and in many images and figures featuring the two together, they are often seen side by side, like Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, with Nefertiti standing as a right hand or an advisor. As the advisor or queen regent alongside Tutankhamun, Nefertiti seemed to have great responsibility, and her responsibilities as queen regent even went as far as to hand down her own burial objects to Tutankhamun when he faced an early death at 19. So next, I'd like to highlight the ancient Egyptians and their unique role of women within their government and society. So I've discussed Queen Regency in the case of Hatshepsut and Nefertiti both, and they most likely had very similar experiences. So the role of women in ancient Egypt was very, I would say, unique to their time period. Ancient Egyptian women were expected to be the traditional homemaker, looking after sons and daughters while maintaining their education and the education of their children. Ancient Egyptian women were also expected to be knowledgeable about their government and society, and they were expected to to be present in conversations about political policy and their government. So, though Hatshepsut and Nefertiti have similar experiences, and we often think about Hatshepsut being one of the first queen regents and pharaohs, one of the first cases of queen regency or rulership likely took place in the 5th dynasty. So there was a queen named Setibor, and she was likely one of the first queens to be queen regent and ruler, and there's significant evidence through excavations showing that she was very well favored, and even her pyramid was larger than that of the pharaoh, her husband. Overall, the ancient Egyptians were unique to their view and role of women in society. Hatshepsut was most definitely not frowned upon for acting as king. She was worshipped as all other pharaohs were, which shows that the title was somewhat symbolic and not necessarily tied to just the male gender. To conclude, iconoclasm is not a thing of the past. Most recently, we have seen iconoclasm in the United States, inspired by the rise of social justice movements, especially this summer. We have seen many statues featuring the colonization and the Confederacy intentionally destroyed, like above, this is a monument of Christopher Columbus. We've seen these destroyed because of the kind of glorification of a problematic past history. Contemporary iconoclasm in the United States acknowledges the existence of negative history while questioning their prominence in public spaces through the display of monuments, statues, valorizing the Confederacy were often made approximately 50 years after the end of the Civil War, during the beginning of the Jim Crow era. This drastic increase of Confederate monuments shows how the United States embraced and glorified the history of enslaved peoples. To dismantle and damage these monuments today means acknowledging a deeply painful past created by those portrayed as philanthropists and humanitarians. Along with the United States, ISIS, an Islamic militant group based in the Middle East, has been weaponizing iconoclasm in recent decades. ISIS intentionally destroys ancient Middle Eastern artifacts in order to take them away from a society that wants to preserve them. ISIS believes that these ancient Middle Eastern artifacts are being glorified as if they're their own religion, and they heavily frown upon this uplifting of artifacts with the primary aim to completely destroy them and take away this option of preservation. The ancient Egyptians used iconoclasm to disable figures and the embodiments within them, while also erasing these figures from their history. And similar to ISIS in the Middle East, they're using this as a weapon for complete erasure. And in the contemporary United States, iconoclasm is being used to acknowledge the problematics of past histories while refocusing on more empowering historical monuments like the Boston's Women's Memorial here at the bottom. Overall, iconoclasm is a practice that has followed us all throughout history. From ancient Egypt to the contemporary United States and Middle East, it has proven to be something so dynamic and still an area of study that needs more attention and recognition. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sidney. And I'm excited to think about the connections between memory between the last two papers. But without further ado, so we're on time, we are going to move to Through Our Eyes, Reclamation of the Black Female Body, presented by Malanah Hobgood here from UNCCH as well. And I think we're going to have a really wonderful connections between these papers. Okay, take it away.
I will share my screen. Okay. Sorry, I'm pressing this. Okay, all right, here we go. Through Our Eyes, Reclamation of the Black Female Body. New photographic technologies produce new means of representation which help the advancement of social and political matters. The commercialization of the daguerreotype in 1839 changed the way the public received and viewed current issues about emancipation and the Civil War. Enslaved African Americans did not have the means of representation or political agency over their life. Their lives were perceived from a Euro/Euro-American male gaze, who only saw them as an object who they can profit from. The only identity enslaved peoples had was the one placed upon them by their owner, who saw them nothing more but property. This lack of humanity and identity can be seen through various portraits of African Americans during this period. It was not until the late 18th and early 19th century African Americans started to gain control of their own image and used that image to improve the conditions of previously enslaved African Americans. Sojourner Truth and W.E.B. Du Bois subverted the misrepresentation of African Americans in earlier photographic practices by using photography as a tool to advance African Americans after being enslaved rather than previous use of photographs that continue oppression. Sojourner Truth used her self-portrait to support abolitionist ideologies and the circulation of racial knowledge, while W.E.B. Du Bois used photography to create a counter-archive of African-American Black life in the South. My presentation will demonstrate the profoundness of what Sojourner Truth did with her image in a comparative context with W.E.B. Du Bois photographic practices. Photographs of African American mostly occurred from an ethnographic lens of enslaved people before Sojourner Truth and Du Bois contributions. While different cultures of picture making outside of scientific photography of African descent peoples did exist, those images were from a French perspective, such as French photographer Félix Nadar's photographs of the bourgeois class seen in the image on the left, photographs of African descent women as nannies and household maids in the image on the right, and images of sexuality. A specific example of ethnographic photography of African American is Joseph T. Zeeley's commissioned daguerreotype for Louis Agassiz. Zeeley captured images for Agassiz of an enslaved family in the semi-nude for comparative studies of anatomy and physiognomy. These comparative studies were to show the belief that white bodies was superior to the Black body, justifying it with pseudoscience. The image of Drana shows a woman of color sitting in a frontal view and staring directly in the camera with her bare breast exposed. On her breast, there are markings that suggest she was previously whipped or some sort of violence was inflicted on her. Her hands are clasped in front of her as they lay on her lap. There is remnants of her clothing that appear to be rolled down to expose herself as if she was undressed by someone else. There is a stark contrast between the color of the woman's skin, which is Black in the image, and her clothing, which is white. There's a stoic expression across her face as if she knows the injustice that is done to her. The anthropologist capturing the image is not supposed to be situated within the photograph, but yet these photographs are clearly representation of his imagination and scientific schema, representation of him more than his subjects. Louis Agassiz's photographs are part of a larger study of eugenics that was one type of representation, but certainly a central strand of earlier photographic practices. In comparison to the image of Drana, who did not commission or ask for a picture to be taken, as a previously illiterate enslaved person, Sojourner Truth taking authorship of her image and circulation is a radical accomplishment. Sojourner Truth took her image in her own hands on how she wanted to stage/present herself. Her carte de visite, I Sell the Shadow to Support the Substance, 1864, is a self-portrait placing Sojourner Truth sitting at a table as she holds knitting needles and yarns as she stares directly at the audience. While staring at the audience, her head is slightly tilted, suggesting endearment, making her image more accessible to a wider audience. Similar to Drana, Truth's figure is Black while the fabric of her shawl, bonnet, and yarn is white. This was purposeful choice as her body and the photograph is the shadow she is selling. During this period, she was traveling, giving lectures and classes about the abolition of slavery and rights of women. The substance Truth is referring to is the lectures and her cost of living while traveling. The image paid for her food, repaid debts, and even allowed her to buy a home and support her and her grandson's illness. Sojourner Truth made the conscious decision in her self-fashioning of her carte de visite to make it more marketable. By selling her image after her speeches, this created an identity of herself that was connected to abolitionist movement and women's rights. By capturing her image, I Sell the Shadow to Support the Substance, this aligned her with paper money, adding value to herself, which was deliberate. She copyrighted her image so it remained her own property and not someone else's, which maximized her profits. Truth's active use of iconography, legal protection, and marketing allowed for the abolitionist and women's rights ideology to exist after her speeches ended and to be spread around the world through the presence of her carte de visite. In comparison to Louisa Ghazi's photograph for Drana, Sojourner Truth commissioned her own photograph, taking control of her image to support a cause that benefited previously disenfranchised people of color. While Sojourner Truth utilized the self-portrait for the advancement of African Americans, W.E.B. Du Bois organized a counter archive for the 1900 Paris exhibition that showcased 363 photographs into 3 albums labeled the Georgia Negro exhibit to show what the Negro really is in the South. The exhibition also included a series of charts and graphs documenting the social and economic status of African Americans and maps depicting African American population of various Georgia counties. As art historian Sean Michelle Smith writes, Du Bois, quote, Du Bois aimed not simply to challenge the racist images, but also to reconfigure the racialized structures of the gaze through which the suggested race was formulated and racial identification negotiated, end quote. Du Bois used the same photographic methodology of capturing the figure in profile as used by Louisa Ghazi in his album, seen in the image here. The difference between the two is that Du Bois was able to, while the images were meant to objectively convey the individuality and personality of the sitter and perhaps recognition between photographer and subjects. With the help of photographer Thomas Askew, Du Bois was able to showcase the African-American upper middle class, subverting the ideas of the uncivilized Negro as previously seen in the 1900 Paris exposition. Du Bois was able to rewrite the misrepresentation of African Americans through photography and showcase African American experiences, progress, sense, and individuality. Sojourner Truth and W.E.B. Du Bois were able to use photography for the advancement of previously enslaved people. By doing so, this allowed for ideas of futurity and worth for African Americans. Before Truth and Du Bois' photographic endeavors, the main images in circulation were those of infographic studies. These photographs for the scientific gaze still placed enslaved peoples as objects, taking away their humanity and identity. Du Bois' photographs showed the sitter identity, even though using the same photographic practices used for infographic photography, subverting the format. He placed the American Negro in a different perspective that affected how other countries saw Negroes in the South. Sojourner Truth was able to add worth back to the sitter by having agency to capture her own self-image and use it to her own ends and aims. By doing so, she was able to support herself and continue to teach others about the abolition of slavery and rights for women. She was a modern-day businesswoman who used her own image to support a cause she believed in and change the way women of color are perceived. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Malanah. And now I'll welcome any Q&A questions that we've got going. There was one mention of praise in the Q&A from Pat Leviton to say that she appreciated how Sidney's thorough paper brought it iconoclasm right up to today with BLM, which I think we can all really appreciate. And we have some other questions coming in. This one was great too, she said. So what struck me was the idea of memory, obviously, that brought these all together. And this idea of, I think we started off with the idea of the theoretical kind of backing of memory work and what that meant in Michelle's paper. And then casting the gaze forward, as well as merging chronological periods. Whereas in Sidney's paper, we really get a sense of the idea of the past influencing the future and the present, and thus the kind of need for iconoclasm and the dangers of iconoclasm. And then we move into Malanah's, and I think there's even more. I mean, there's so many photographs from that Du Bois collection that are so wonderful. And there are even these theories that he progresses you through the exhibition, moving from the kind of more anthropological gaze into a more informal pose on some of the photos on purpose to subvert the photographic kind of iconography or norms. So I'd love it if each of you could kind of maybe just engage with the idea of memory and thinking about expanding upon memory perhaps in one other facet if you want to. I'm going to keep open looking at the Q&A if we've got other people. Okay. So we have a few minutes. Does anybody want to go first? And I have more specific questions too, if you want.
Well, I guess I will start. So I think for memory, just what Sojourner Truth was doing, like as I mentioned at the end of my presentation, was that by capturing her own image, an image that does last forever, she is, like I said, the futurity of African American women. She's making a statement that we can control our own image, thus controlling our own future. So by photographing herself, she's placing in that memory and that history of that we are something that can have control in our own lives. So going back to Sidney's presentation, like the iconoclasm, I believe like during that time, I believe that these people knew what these sculptures, what these symbols meant for the future. So by destroying these iconic images of the iconic story, they're kind of taking away that memory in a way to show that, okay, by destroying this will no longer exist. But in a way, it's kind of actually placing it more in the future. It's kind of making a statement rather than disrupting the entire history of what was happening in the Egyptian times.
Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking about the fact that in some cases for the kind of the purposeful kind of liberatory iconoclasm that's going on now with the BLM movement, that there are moments in which we've seen the removal in some cases, but in some cases, the purposeful defacement and preservation of a thing in order to merge those two, which reminds me of Michelle's talk of this idea of we need to remember this past and this overemphasis of iconography and erase it somewhat and make it fade in those ways that those photographs blended. Oh, I get so excited about the iconography. Sidney, do you have a response to Malanah's comment?
I was just thinking about like this idea for all three presentations of, I guess, legacy in a sense, what you're leaving behind, what you want to leave behind, and this idea of, I guess, in Michelle's presentation of these familial ties and what family brings with you or what you leave, what you have from your family, and then this idea of questioning legacy and representation in Malanah's presentation with questioning how former slaves and slaves were represented in photographs to changing it into something more empowering, showing a sense of self, and then questioning legacy in the sense of iconoclasm in ancient Egypt and really what you want to leave behind and this idea of what should be left behind and who decides that.
Ooh, I love the term you used, just bringing out legacy as this like really important through line. That's great. Do you have anything to add, Michelle?
Yeah, I'm thinking about like specifically, I wrote down, Sidney, during your talk, the language you were using. You were using damaging, disabling, and then dismantling. And then Malanah, you were talking about like subverting genres and kind of hit it, Dr. Perrill, on the head. For mine is it's about how do you maintain historical ties and project those into the future. And so I think, you know, there's a way that history is still present, even if it's being altered to the point of almost not being recognizable, perhaps. And I'm wondering, Sidney, if you can talk about the idea of disabling something. And so when you are perhaps, you know, hitting a nose off of a sphinx, that you're somehow hurting the agency of an object. So I guess agency of materiality was something that came up to me in our three talks as well.
And if I could jump in, there's also this connection that we have Dr. Roving coming on in the Q&A talking about the idea of ancestors and descendants as if in communication across history. And the materiality of that, like you're saying, Michelle, is really key. And we have one other comment I'm just going to bring into the fold of somebody commenting on Toni Morrison's work and the idea of memory, and in, Beloved and Jazz coming to mind about the ideas of memories speaking across time. Yeah, any comments on what Michelle was saying about materiality, Sidney?
I think it's when I started my research, Dr. Perrill was like, this is big. This is such a big project because you're coming from this ancient Egyptian belief system to also a practice. And you're coming into the ancient Egyptians believing in there's a representation within any figure. So I guess in the sense of a photograph, there's a sense of that person is in the photograph. But in these figures, they felt that the person being represented was in the figures. So I guess this destruction and disabling is kind of taking away a piece of them and not allowing them to be present within their representation.
We're also getting some praise for connecting the dots so thoroughly on all your parts. So do you have any thoughts about the ancestors and descendants kind of speaking across time as well, Malanah? I'm just curious. You haven't spoken for a moment, so give me space.
So going back, I was looking at the Q&A, I believe it was from Victoria, I believe. Okay. So I think like she said, the connection across time between certain descendants. My first thought was thinking about Creamy Reams and her work with the image of Drana, and then adding text, kind of reclaiming back the image from Luzagazi / Joseph T. Zealy. So I think when it comes to the connection between descendant and ancestor, I think that we today are seeing the injustice done, what we've known, and we're seeing it, and yet nothing has been done about it yet. So I think artists today are trying to or make some type of purpose or add some type of meaning to the work that was done by these infographic photographers, and taking it back, so reclaiming it back and placing it in a history that doesn't see more as a negative, but see it more as or change it to see more as a positive instead, for future people to see, like, okay, her body, the injustice done to her body wasn't done in vain. We as women today, or we as African Americans, or any type of people from African descent, can reclaim our bodies. That's not our only history. We are creating, and we have other histories outside of what was done to us.
And it reminds me of Edmonia Lewis and kind of all the carvers of the 1900s, all those women who made such amazing work that resonated with Egyptian, art. There really was this purposeful reclaiming of saying, okay, this is not the only story. Like, what narrative can I build across time and project a different future? How can I blend these lines between history and now in order to find some greater purpose? Wow. This is a really good panel. Thank you guys, every single one of you. And thank you to all the participants and all the attendees here at CACE. We do want to be respectful of time because there's another one coming on after us. And yeah, thank you very, very much for a wonderful panel. I can't wait to see each of your careers moving forward. I love it. So I guess we have to say goodbye, but without further ado, you're the best.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yay. Thank you, everybody, for coming.